Hey friend, it's me Vasco with a quick announcement. We at the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast are organizing this year's Scrum Master Summit. For tickets and details on the summit, check out the URL bit.ly/SM Summit 22. All one word, SMSUMMIT 22. And now, on to the show. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Thursday, Success Thursday here this week with Bevan Williams.
Awesome. Hi, good to be back again, Vasco.
Absolutely. So, Bevan, Thursdays are success days here on the podcast, and we do want to talk about that. But before we dive into it, of course, we'll talk about the tool that we most often use to try to reach that successful outcome, which is the retrospective. So, share with us, what's your favorite retrospective format and why?
I love mixing up retrospective formats. I love them as questions. I guess if I had to pick a technique, probably the timeline retrospective format is my favorite because it takes into account the whole period that we're reflecting on. It really gives that space for people to really reflect on what happened. So from a behaviors, from a almost an evidence perspective, but then I really like the addition of, how did we feel about these things? So what was the state of me throughout the sprint as well? I'm a big fan of bringing the whole human into work as well, and that includes sharing when we've just, I wasn't in a good space, and actually that's what influenced this point on the retrospective, and also being able to see what things caused individual downtrends or uptrends versus whole team ones as well.
Yeah, these triggers are very important because they are related to who we are as people and where we are at that particular point in time. So when we ask things like, okay, so, I imagine that one of the things you would do in this kind of timeline retrospective is to have the line that goes up and down that kind of reflects the mood, right? And then kind of illustrate that line with the specific events. And when an event is at a point that is immediately preceding a down trend in mood, if that's what you're measuring, or happiness or satisfaction, then you can then ask, why was that? Like, what was it about this event that triggered that kind of change in mood, right? And I think that really helps to understand not only what happened, if we talk about it from a purely process improvement perspective, we can learn from what happened, right? But also, it helps us to understand the people we work with, right? Because a particular point in time may be a reason for somebody to become even more motivated to solve a problem, but it also may be a trigger for someone else to be demotivated and step back.
Absolutely. And I've experienced that as which is probably why it's the one that stands out the most for me, because I've seen these beautiful conversations emerge where, an event happens and some people are like, this was really negative for me. And some other people are like, it was really positive for me. And without even any kind of further intervention from me, just sitting in the background, watching the conversations that emerge, I'm like, wow, like, you found that really negative? Like, it's so weird. I found it really positive. And just kind of emerging those differences in perception that people have about certain events and how they take it on board or not take it on board. And then maybe even they had different understandings of what that event meant as well. And just to see that alignment and kind of shared understanding emerge is always quite a beautiful thing for me. It's when I see that in teams, I get weirdly excited about it.
Absolutely. Because, teams are systems of people. And as we start to also help them to understand each other, they become better at what they are doing, and also more empathic and helpful and collaborative, etc. Bevan, of course, we do all of this because we want to succeed in our role as Scrum Master. So in order to do that, we first must define what does that look like. So that's the question for you, Bevan. So what does success look like for you as a Scrum Master?
I'd sum it up from kind of a comment from earlier in the week was, if I can step away and the team asks me to come back. So it's not so much as I need to be needed so much thing. It's just that the team themselves feel like they don't need someone to help facilitate them because they've learned those techniques themselves. They're working together. They truly own their way of working with their product owner or product manager, but they realize the value in having a coach. And for me, that would be the ultimate kind of measure of success for myself, at least, as a kind of a more subjective one, I guess.
So, of course, as we work with teams and we're never only at the end, right? And we change teams, we start the whole process all over again. So we want to look at maybe signs, hints, things that tell us that, yeah, we're progressing. Because there's not one way to get there, right? Like there's not one way to get the team to own their process. There's not one way to help teams understand the power of reflection that a coach can bring. So how do you do that these days? Like when you start working with a team or a set of teams, what are the things you're looking for in those early stages that tell you that, we're headed the right direction?
I guess the first two things that came to mind when asking that was the daily scrums. So that daily scrums, if the team owns it and they feel that they can make changes to it and they can decide the content and the agenda and when it happens, that's a good sign for me. That's a sign of, they're starting to realize that they have more ownership over the process. It's a small one, but I've seen the impact that has in the broader scheme of things, right? So it's kind of a safe change for them to make. So it's generally, I found in the past, easier to convince, managers or stakeholders that are using it potentially as their status update meeting. I found it a bit easier that once the team takes, that ownership of that, it tends to expand to other areas. And related to that is the ownership of their board. And this one I find quite tough in really, really large organizations that maybe have a bit more process around who can edit their, Jira permissions or their Azure DevOps permissions, etc. But that's another good sign for me. If the team can own their own board and how they track their progress, while keeping in mind that other people consume this information as well, that's a sign of success. So a good starting point for me is normally take a look at the daily scrums. Do they feel like they have ownership at doing that? Naturally, will make changes and they will emerge them in the retrospectives. But when they do their board, I find that there's still a lot of ownership of that outside the team. You must update your ticket number, and there's not a lot of context shared why. So part of that ownership is owning those two things at a start.
One of the things that comes to mind as you were describing what you're looking for, right, like the daily scrums and their own board, is this ability to reflect and make changes deliberately. Something you would see in a retrospective, but also outside, right? Like, so how do teams own their board? Well, they might change how the process works. But if you think about it, they have first defined how it works, right? Like you can't change something if it hasn't been defined. So one of the things that I've seen that is very cool in teams when it comes to owning their board is that they actually have regular conversations about what does it mean for a card to be here and why is this card here and not there, right? Like, and it's not in terms of having those questions as conflict driving questions, although there might be some conflicting views of what should be, but rather as a trigger to come to an agreement, right? Kind of, hey, how about if instead of putting the tester as the owner of a ticket that goes into the test column, we put the product owner as the owner of the ticket. What would happen, right? Like that kind of conversations I find are great indications that the team, even if they don't yet, they are moving towards really practically owning how the board is structured and how they interact with it.
Absolutely. I find exactly the same thing in my experience. So, one of the techniques that I always do with specifically around the board, especially because everyone's remote these days, right? I still miss my whiteboard days. I still, have surrounded myself with Post-its and stationery. So, back then it was a little bit easier. We would go and take a bunch of Post-its and say, let's figure out what our process looks like. And then people could make changes to it. So, nowadays it's trying to find what's the least fidelity tool that we can use to speak about things. So something like Miro or Mural, Google Slides even is really, really good for teams because it's relatively intuitive. So taking people out of maybe the technical tool that they have to use that can sometimes be overwhelming, and then kind of figuring out their process. And then for them, it's the same thing of, making changes is the safety of it. If they make changes, will they get into trouble, right? So that's, even in my own experience, I didn't want to change things back in the day because I'm like, if I change that, the manager's going to shout at me. So I need to test that first. So can we make changes and realize that, there's safety to make that and kind of build up this confidence over time, saying you can make changes to your process. And what might be the impact of that? Let's try it. Let's do it. You want to add a new column to your board? Let's do it. And do you want to remove that column now because you've learned something about it? Okay, cool. I'll figure out how to do that for you, or we can figure it out together as a nicer approach.
Yeah, and that's a great example of being encouraging in that respect, because there will be, no matter how much we ignore it or even try to hide it, there will be an attempt to change something in the process when a problem comes up, right? And at that point is when we should be encouraging and also, in my perspective, suggest this idea that any change is an experiment, right? We can always go back. If it doesn't work, that's okay too, right? We learn, we move on.
Absolutely. So it's that let's try it. And I think, in a later stage, as the team becomes more confident with this, they'll start using that language. And that's probably another behavior that is good to see, is when they start using the behavior of let's try things, let's explore, or we don't know what this is going to impact, but let's try it. We've thought about all the potential risks, but let's try it and see what it does. And okay, that didn't really work out. How do we revert it? Or what can we try next? Is a good word phrase to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another great phrase. What can we try next? Those are great sharing and great ideas and tips on how to help teams move towards owning their process. So thank you for that, Bevan.
Oh, welcome.
Hey friends, it's Vasco again, now with a bit longer announcement. I'm part of the team that is behind the Global Scrum Master Summit, the conference dedicated to the Scrum Master role. If you're a Scrum Master, the Scrum Master Summit is the place to learn, to share, and of course to meet new friends. We will have lots of live sessions where you can meet and network with other Scrum Masters from the whole globe. So make sure you check it at bit.ly/SM Summit 22. We have several amazing keynotes and 7 tracks that feature people like you and of course thought leaders sharing their insights, their knowledge, and helping you become an awesome Scrum Master. You can check out all of the details of the summit, including the keynotes announced, the track chairs, and much more at bit.ly/SM Summit 22. That's all one word. That's bit.ly/SM SUMMIT and the numeral 22. I'll see you on the conference floor.